Is that all right? Can we just do a wee round of introductions? And Elaine, you can maybe facilitate who's putting their hand up, because I can't see them.
Let's all do that, because I'm probably going to dip out.
On you go then. Who'd like to go first? Lindsay.
Lindsay, you're on mute.
Yep, it's okay. I've been muted. Well, I'm on the scrutiny panel for Link Housing, the tenant scrutiny panel. I'm also on the regional network central region, so I have quite a broad field of interests, and I was particularly interested in this. So I'm really looking forward to what you've got to say, Claire.
Good. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing you as well, especially if you've got all that wide interest.
Okay.
Thanks, Lindsay. Tricia, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Tricia Hunter. I work for Fortra. I'm actually a member of staff. I've come on today because initially we didn't have a board member that was available to come to this. And I said I would be quite interested in finding out what Claire has got to say. But since then, managed to get a hold of Pat, so Pat's here as well, and I decided I'm staying anyway. I'm going to listen in, so I'm just going to sit, be quiet, and take a few notes if that's okay.
Thanks, Tricia. Dolly, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi there, my name's Dolly, and I'm new to my post in the Western Isles as Tenant Participation Officer. So looking forward to your talk.
Thanks, Dolly. Pat, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name's Pat Kirkcaldy and I live in Kirkcaldy. I'm on the board of Fortra. I'm also a member of Ravenscraig Tenants Association, and I do scrutiny as well. And I was quite interested to come and hear what was going to get said as well. And I'm quite glad Tricia's here because she's cleverer than me.
Don't believe that for a minute.
John?
I'm John Duffy. I'm a member of Region 4 in the Scottish Executive Group. And I'm from Shotts in Lanarkshire.
Okay, thanks, John. And we've got Rose as well.
I'm Rose O'Doherty. I'm a tenant of Govanhill Housing Association. And I heard about this from Jennifer Ferguson, who's the Tenant Participation Officer. And I kind of go along to Jennifer's evening sessions, well, when we were having them physically. And I've kept in touch with Jennifer throughout lockdown. So she mentioned this to me and I was very interested. So I've just come along to listen and hopefully participate.
Okay, thanks. I think Grace has joined the conversation, Lisa, as well. Grace?
Yeah. Do you want to introduce yourself, Grace?
Are you on mute, Grace?
Okay. I'm Grace from Parkhead Housing Association.
Thanks, Grace.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yep,
yes,
can hear you fine. Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm Lisa Lafferty. I work for TPAS Scotland. Claire, nice to meet you.
You too.
I'm Leslie.
So if anybody's any questions that they want to ask, if they can just use the hand function, and we'll keep an eye open for that. You can also use the chat function as well. If you want to type in your question, we can ask it on your behalf. Okay, over to you now, Claire. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Do you know, it's brilliant for me being with tenants again, because 20 years of my life has been spent working with tenants and tenant participation. As Leslie said, I've worked for TIS for 10 years. I set up the East Lothian project. And when I started in East Lothian, there was, I think, 6 tenants groups. And when I left, there were 24. And it was incredible working with the tenants panel in East Lothian. And then I spent 8 years at Edinburgh Tenants Federation as well. So I'm thrilled to be kind of back where my roots are, speaking to tenants and listening to tenants today. So thank you so much for the opportunity to come along today. It's brilliant to kind of hear you've been from all over the parts of Scotland, because before we had Zoom and Teams, it would have been hard to get us all together in the one room. So I'm really thankful that we're able to actually use some of the bad stuff around COVID to turn it into good things to bring us together. So thank you so much for coming. Today's session is probably less about me talking than you might think, because it's about you also giving a bit of a view around a new human rights law for Scotland. I don't know how much you know about, there's been a task force that's been looking at human rights in Scotland for about a year now. And one of the things they're looking at is how could they bring international human rights law into Scottish law, and that would include the right to housing. So this task force has been set up, and it's got kind of big brains on it who are academics and lawyers and constitutional law folk. But as well as that, they've got the Human Rights Consortium, who I'm working for at the moment, and they're kind of a membership-based organisation that anybody can join if you're interested around human rights in Scotland. So on that task force, they've been kind of the voice of civil society, if you like, in Scotland, of ordinary people and of third sector organisations and community groups. So I've been doing a little bit of work with them since September to have conversations with community groups, with marginalised groups across Scotland to find out what people might think about if we have a new human rights law in Scotland. Vary, who is the director of the Human Rights Consortium, will be typing up all the notes that I've been gathering in conversations throughout the last few months, and will be reporting to this task force in the end of January this year, and next year rather. And then that task force is directly reporting to the First Minister by March next year, with the idea being then after the elections, depending on who is obviously elected in Scotland in May in the Scottish elections, there being a new human rights law being written and brought together towards Parliament, I think, next year. So this is not a formal consultation that you would be used to in terms of, you know, the Housing Act. And remember way back in 2001 doing loads of sessions about the Housing Act, and then, you know, the other acts that have come on the back of that, because there's not been a law written yet. So we're right at the start of a process before there's actually any law being put onto paper. And at the moment, I'm just really going around chatting to groups of people in Scotland to find out what their views are. But rather than me speaking too much, I wanted to find out from you in the chat box how much you know about human rights in Scotland. So the options are, I don't know very much about human rights, I know a wee bit about human rights, or loads about human rights. And it doesn't matter what you know. If you type in the chat box how much you think you know about human rights in Scotland, you could write loads, a little, not sure. If you just pop that in the chat box, that'll help us to get a wee flavour of what people think they already know. And while you're doing that, I'll tell you a little bit about my learning in human rights, because it started about 6 years ago when I was working with the Federation, and we set up a housing rights project, working with tenants in Leith to get improvements to their housing conditions. So I still feel like, although I've been working in human rights for about 6 years, I still think that I just know a wee bit, because every time I feel like I learn a bit more, there's always more that I have to learn. So Lisa and Leslie don't know much, or know a little bit, or not much at all, not a lot. Good, just keep typing in there. Rose knows a wee bit about human rights, especially from the LGBT community. Fantastic. Just keep typing in there if you get a chance. No, very little. Do you know, it's fine because most of the people that I've been speaking to across Scotland have said that actually we don't know that much about human rights. And that's one of the points that we need to consider if there's going to be a new human rights law in Scotland. It's people need to actually know their rights to be able to claim them. One of the things I've been doing with all the conversations I've been having across Scotland as well is asking people to put in the chat box, what words do you associate with human rights? If somebody said to you, why are human rights important? What would you say back to them? Any words that you can think of. And what we're going to do at the end of the consultation period, which runs till the end of January, is all the comments that people write in the chat boxes in the conversations that I've had, we're going to make them into a big word cloud, and then we'll be able to send them over to the First Minister and say, actually, here are some of the words that people already associate with human rights in Scotland. So fire away in the chat box any words that you associate with human rights. And I'll give you a wee minute to do that. While you're doing that, Leslie, I'm just going to ask if in a minute you're okay to put on the wee film that we've got.
Yeah, I've got it here, and Lisa's got it as well. Have you got it there, Lisa? I've got it. Yeah, it should work okay. If I can't get it, we've got a fallback, which is Lisa. Is that okay, Lisa? Yeah, okay. That's
Perfect. So we'll just read through some of these comments, and then we'll be able to go into the film in just a minute. So equality of opportunity, the right to a house, the right to live your life with no, I'm not sure if you got cut off there, Leslie, in your mid-sentence in your chat box.
I did a panic because you asked me a question. So
all right, that's okay. I do that all the time, and then I forget to put on my microphone, and then people are like, "You've not got your microphone on." I'm like, it's too much stress. Anyway, you can finish your thought process now then, Leslie. Delina's saying empowerment, security, freedom, equality, another one for equality, being fair, discriminating, equality. Grace is a fair bit about right to family, housing, fair hearing, freedom of expression and association, a lack of discrimination, people being treated equally. All of those are really, really important in human rights, and giving people the dignity and respect in their daily lives and everything that they do. So thank you so much for that, and I can't wait to see it when it's on a big Scottish word cloud, you know, and we've got all those words from everybody. Pat, thanks, being listened to. So what I'm going to do, we've got a wee 3-minute film. It is quite short and sweet, and it explains a wee bit more about what this process is in a shortened way, and it's a wee kind of pictorial thing. So I'll ask Leslie or whoever's firing it on from TPAS to pop on the film, and then we can take some questions afterwards.
Can you see it? No, yeah. You can see it.
Yeah, I can see it.
We can see a data protection privacy conference, which is not quite the same link. Just take your time, Leslie.
Hold on. Right, okay, so it's the wrong one. It's the wrong one. Right, let me try again. Oh, that's the wrong one as well. Go away. Right, Claire, Lisa, do you have it?
I'll try and share it with you.
Right, okay, because I've obviously failed miserably to share it.
Right, share.
Well, I'll just talk amongst ourselves anyway.
You got it, Claire? I had it opened up so that I could get it to go, but obviously I'm not doing that now.
Shall I send you over? Would that be helpful?
I've got it. Yeah,
Oh,
I'll
you've got
try
it.
again. Lisa, are you still trying?
Here,
Is that-
I've
you've got it.
here. It's okay. It's
Right,
just
okay.
taking a wee minute. Okay, just cancel that. Are you able to see my screen now?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Right, it should come up in a wee second. Internet just seems really, really slow today.
Yeah, same.
We've been having Wi-Fi wars in our house because my 2 kids are working from home as well. So it's like, everybody off.
Yeah. I think it's coming up now, Lisa. Yeah. Oh, here we are.
There we are.
Oh, we got volume. No.
You not hear it?
No.
No, did you just, sometimes there's a wee button where you just have to click and it says share screen and share volume at the same time. Share computer audio usually when you're sharing screen.
No.
Technology settings.
You can see it now. Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually got subtitles all the way through. So if you just
Right.
put it back to the beginning, we can watch it without the wee twinkly tune
Right.
on it, and we could
Yeah.
kind of sing in the background. It just goes doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. And it's got subtitles, I think, all the way through. So we should be okay. Everything's visual on the screen, so we should be okay to see that. If you want to make that full screen, that'll be cool.
Yeah, I'm going to try and share it just now.
At least it's sharing it. Oh, so it's
wait a
gone now.
minute. No, is Elaine went in?
I think, Elaine, have you taken over control?
Yeah, I've taken over control, put it on. That's you hear the sound on it.
We can't see it.
I'll need to stop sharing my screen then if Elaine's came in.
We're not seeing anything at all, Elaine.
It was just about to start there as well.
Here we are. Okay. No, we're not hearing anything, Elaine. No.
That's fine. Just take it back to the beginning, and we'll just watch it without the sound. As I say, it's got all of the subtitles
Elaine,
on the screen.
that's what I've got on my screen. If you want to stop sharing yours, because I'm in the midst of sharing mine's as well.
Right, I've stopped sharing it.
Right. Right.
Should be able to get the sound on it, no problem. It gives you an option.
And it's asking me to.
So Lisa's gone now.
Oh, the technology is mad, eh?
Lisa must have. Elaine, just you share it again and ask it for sound, please. Are you still there?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. If you want to share it, Lisa obviously left the room.
This is the real life of how we do stuff with technology.
I know. Right. Back to the start, Elaine. Right, and just let it run. There we go.
Great, thanks for sharing, Elaine. It's brilliant. Yeah, you can stop sharing now. What we can maybe do is afterwards we can fire the wee film around, because it's on YouTube. You'll be able to see it if we fire it around after. But basically that's telling us that there are some laws which at the UN level are not actually applicable into Scottish law. So things that are missing include economic, social and cultural rights, which includes the right to housing, the right to food and the right to health. And there are some other rights that could be brought into laws in Scotland for particular groups, including specific rights for people with disabilities, for women, for Black and minority ethnic people, for older people and for LGBTI people. Is there anything that surprised you from what you saw in that wee film? Any rights that you thought you already had, which you're like, oh, didn't realise I didn't have that? Anybody got any reaction to that, just as a kickstart? If you put your head up and your hand up rather, and Elaine will tell me who's trying to speak because I can't see you.
No.
John's trying to speak, Claire?
Yeah. It's just to mention that I was at a meeting with the British Institute of Human Rights, and I was shocked to discover that people have no right to housing. And I took up that with the Scottish Housing Regulator as well. I brought it to his notice, and he said there are various organisations working on that part. But I was astonished to understand that. Thank you.
Me too, John. I'm glad that you brought that up, and I'm glad you've had a pincer movement to the regulator as well around that. There's been a lot of talk about that. Certainly, you know, that last had Scottish Housing Day, which was about the right to housing. Shelter have been quite strongly campaigning on the right to housing, along with a number of homelessness charities. But you're absolutely right. The right to an adequate standard of living includes the right to housing, and you don't currently have that in Scottish law or in British law, but this new law will only be for Scotland. And that's quite a surprise, isn't it?
I was speaking to a housing manager. She says, John, I've been a housing manager for 26 years and I never knew that. I found that astonishing. Astonishing.
I think Rose has got her hand up as well, Claire.
Yes, just to endorse John's view, I was shocked to learn we didn't have rights in housing. As I said, I'm a tenant of Govanhill Housing Association and have been for 25 years. And that just shocked me. So
me too. Yeah.
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 Any other thoughts around that?
I think there's a lot of assumptions made because you know you can be allocated a house at 16, that you take that to the next what you think is level of understanding is that means you have a right to house, because we always talk about those in the greatest need will be housed. So I suppose, like John and Rose, that we think that means that you have a right to housing, where it actually doesn't at all. Yeah, really surprised about that, Claire.
Mm-hmm. Section 8 says you have to be affordable, comfortable, waterproof, but it's the cart before the horse, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I picked up in the film was it was saying that people had the right to adequate housing, Claire, and adequate is maybe something different to each person. What might be adequate to one person isn't adequate to another, so it's quite vague, isn't it?
There are quite specific parameters in terms of what that means, adequate housing, in terms of the UN stuff. And we could maybe do a separate session about that if people are interested in it sometime in the future, because it is about things like affordability, it's about housing standards, which we would probably call the Scottish Housing Quality Standard, but it is about you know, the right to be wind and watertight, to not have vermin, to not have mould or whatever in people's houses. So it is a bit more tight in that sense, and international how it's defined, if you like. But we don't have that in Scots law. We still don't have it in a way that you could take someone to court that you don't have a right to housing. We still don't have that. And what's interesting is in New Zealand, they've just brought out a consultation, not about a right to adequate housing, but the right to decent housing. So they want to take it even further than we've already even got in law here. And what's interesting as well is in Canada, they've been really pushing as well for that right to housing to be enshrined in law. And in Wales, actually, there's a whole movement about getting the right to housing, what we call incorporated, so brought from the big UN stuff into local laws in Wales as well. So there's a bit of a movement happening, I think.
Yeah. Grace has got her hand up. Grace, you want to ask your question? Just need to unmute.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me. I'm in a public building, so I have to wear my... Yeah, so the fact that there were laws, housing laws about the current one, let's say in England, that says certain groups of people are not allowed to rent, and then at the same time, now sleeping rough for certain groups of people is an offense, especially when Brexit happens. And also the laws for people with no recourse to public fund, and the laws previous, I don't know, I think Scotland has that differently, where only people with priority need and vulnerable groups of people could access social housing. So all those kind of laws kind of contravened the human rights law. And large families obviously can't access, because of the size of properties that are built. Sometimes they have to be split up into different groups. And so there were so many laws that were just taking away people's rights.
You're absolutely right. You're not going to get any argument from me around that either. And I think really important points there, that once we get into a wee bit of the dialogue around what the acts might be on, will be really helpful for you to feed that back into the Scottish Government, because you're right, there's an issue if people don't have recourse to public funds, which means they've come here, they might be an asylum seeker, they might be waiting on their decision being made, but they're not able to access housing. And there's been a bit of a movement, I think, a will from the Scottish Government to enable that support. But because those issues lie with the UK government, there's a bit of a tension there. And that's been one of the questions when I was speaking to people who are in that situation as part of the conversation, saying, does that mean that our human rights are actually in the hands of the UK government or of the Scottish Government? And I think that's one of the things that the new law is going to have to clarify, is actually, if you live in Scotland, does that mean that you have access to these rights, whether or not you're a citizen? Because some people who live in Scotland are not citizens, and will they still have those rights if they're contributing to our society and they live here? Then they should have those rights, but will they with the new law? So great points that you're raising there. Anyone else with their hand up? If there's nobody else with their hand up, what I'll do then is go into the first question that the consultation asks, and I'll pop it in the chat if I can as well. I'm not sure if I can, or maybe Leslie can from that sheet that I sent over. Hold on, just give me a minute. So the first question is, what difference do you think a new human rights law will mean for Scotland? What difference will it make to actually have these laws written into our laws in Scotland? I mean, and you might think it won't make any difference at all, but that's the first question. What difference do you think? That's me able to copy and paste it now, and I'll pop it into the chat, and then I'll fire it open to you to be able to think about that. What difference do you think it would make to have these rights written into Scots law? Grace, if you got your hand up, I can see you, you're on my screen. You're the only person I can see you, which is great.
You just need to unmute yourself again, Grace.
Yeah, no, I mean, to that question, I need to understand one particular question that I'm going to put forward to be able to answer it. You know, when people are being evicted, let's say the housing association will go to their lawyer and their board to take legal proceedings against the tenant. What access does the tenant themselves have to legal advice? Because normally you would have a county court duty scheme at the court, so that when there's a hearing about your eviction, you have access to somebody right there at the court to represent you on the day. I'm not quite sure how it works in Scotland.
I'll open that up. How does that work in Scotland for folk that have got experience of that?
I can say when I was a housing officer, Claire, if we were taking court action against somebody, you would need to put it formally to them in writing, and on the notice of proceedings that you were sending them, there would be a bit on the bottom saying you are entitled to legal support. We advise you to go to a lawyer. However, that would be of your own expense. Majority of our tenants were on benefits, so a lot of them got legal aid. But if they didn't qualify for legal aid, that's where it kind of fell down. But then a lot of them maybe went to shelter or citizens' advice, so they're always entitled to go. And a good landlord will kind of make that they'll make that available to a tenant, because the majority of the time the landlord doesn't want to evict a tenant, but if they are at the court and they are asking for an eviction, they've tried everything beforehand, but they should always recommend that the person get somebody to represent themselves.
So what difference do you think it would make if rights were in law a bit more, and there was something around there that the tenant not only had the right to access legal aid, which they have, but that they had a right to independent advocacy around that? Would that make any difference to tenants' experiences of that kind of traumatic process?
Usually there's supposed to be a duty desk at the court with advisors either from CIB. Community organizations can take turns. Sometimes lawyers themselves will be at the desk just to give advice to people who turn up and they're about to go into the hearing. It's a very quick process. Tenant turns up, you quickly look at their case, negotiate with the other side, agree on what you're going to propose in the court, and it's easy. So I'm not quite sure why there's no duty desk at the court. Whether you're employed on benefits or anything, you should be able to access justice by going with somebody in that hearing.
I think it must be very frightening, though, if you just turn up at court without any support before that. Do you know, what am I going to do? And then, there's somebody who'll speak to you at court. But, I can't help thinking there should be support before it gets to that.
Yeah. I mean, your notice of proceedings, which is a legal notice that a landlord needs to serve you, is live for 6 months. So they've got 6 months to negotiate with the tenant and to advise them as well to prevent this eviction. So part of that advice should be giving them extra support. And if you were to not offer that support, I think a sheriff takes that into account as well, because that's part of your pre-action requirements in law, that you show that you've offered support and you've offered guidance to the person and how to sort this out to prevent evictions. So it is in law that they've got that a landlord should. Private landlords are maybe different though. So if social landlords work a wee bit differently from private landlords, they don't seem to offer the same kind of support as social landlords. So maybe that's where the problem is.
Anyone else got their hands up around that point?
Rose has, Claire.
Rose, fab.
You can keep me right in this, Claire, but one of the differences I think it'll make is with Brexit, we may lose some of our rights. And if these rights are written into law in Scotland, we may be somewhat ahead of the other 3 nations.
You're exactly right, Rose, in the sense that that was the impetus for starting this work 2 years ago, was the fear around Brexit. But not only the fear around Brexit, the fear around the view that the then Conservative Party, now government, had around reviewing the Human Rights Act. So a lot of our protections are bound up with Europe through the Human Rights Act. And we've just heard last week that the UK government wants to review that, but reviewing it from the perspective of actually there are some protections that we might lose. And that's the context that we're in here in Scotland, that in Scotland there's a very different trajectory on human rights than there is in the Westminster Government. And it's progressive in Scotland, in that trying to get these rights into law will help us when it becomes, when laws change with Brexit, but also might help to future-proof and support and protect people going forward. And we don't know what will happen in Scotland in relation to constitutional stuff. We've no idea, but we know that devolution is here to stay. How that might change in the future is that, a glass ball kind of thing for people to look at. But I think that was definitely the driving force for setting up the task force, was that this is pretty worrying that we could lose a lot of our rights in relation to employment rights and other rights that are held up already. And with Brexit and that shift in narrative in the UK government, it would be a little bit scary. But let's not forget either that we're not way ahead of the game here in Scotland. There are loads of countries who have already incorporated the right to housing successfully. And we haven't done it yet. And along with other economic, social and cultural rights, like the right to welfare, the right to food, the right to health, and we haven't done it yet. And what happens in those countries is that if people are not provided with those rights, they can take legal action direct against the duty bearer, which would be the landlord, or would be, the Scottish Government or the local authority or the health board, for not actually being able to access those rights. So that's the difference that having these rights incorporated into our laws would mean, is that people would take action at court to be able to get their rights realised, as the kind of language in human rights terms. And that means kind of progressing over time, going forwards and not backwards. So great, great point that you raised there about the fears of Brexit and others.
Yeah, thanks for that, Claire.
I've got a wee bit of a worry about a pick and mix approach.
Yep. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so just thinking about, because one of the rights was a home that was free from damp.
Yep.
Now, I think there's a lot of houses in Scotland that are very, very damp. And I'm just projecting forward, and I'm sure, we've all heard the anecdotal stories about your dog breathing too heavily. Or, you need to make sure your house is properly ventilated. So I think for me, if we adopted these laws, it would have to be all or nothing. Let's not have a pick and mix approach, or like Dolly lives in the Western Isles. The weather up there can be atrocious sometimes, much worse than down here, and I think it's bad down here sometimes. So just take, like the houses facing onto beaches and sort of real desperate, very difficult weather conditions, which creates sometimes dampness in homes. So yeah, I just worry a little bit about that. And I see that Lindsay's got her hand up just now as well. So I should shut up. Sorry?
We can't see you either, Leslie.
Oh, that's quite a good thing. You should be able to see me. No, I'm quite happy with that.
No, my main concern with all these rights being put into Scots law is, where's the money coming from? Because to have the right to adequate housing, who's determining what's adequate? Because your adequate might be quite different from mine. the right to the best mental and health care. How do you determine what is the best? You know, you can go to Harley Street and see a consultant, cost you a fortune. Is he the best? And is that what the rights offer? I don't think so. And really, somewhere along the line, the determination of how these rights are put in place, how they are operated on a daily basis, when people come to say, I have a right to a house, that's all very well, but if there isn't a physical house to provide, you're up a gum tree. So I have a lot of concerns when it comes to allocating human rights as to how they're policed, how they're implemented, the whole issue round about them.
Those are brilliant points, because you're absolutely right. If you're determining that human rights are right for people in practice, that means that people shouldn't be living on the streets. That means that we shouldn't have homelessness. And those are choices that will cost money at the end of the day. So that's a brilliant question to be feeding back to the Scottish Government, is how much will this cost? And does that mean that when the Scottish Government are making decisions around costs, where do they factor in human rights and the costings of that? So you're at a fantastic question, which I can't wait to put back to the ministers to say, how will that actually work? And at the end of the day, like any other law, it will be up to the courts to determine whether rights have been respected or breached.
I think that at the end of the day, human rights will be very low down the list of priorities when it comes to the crunch.
Yeah, and I think that's a really worrying thing when you see the impact of COVID. You know, when you see how people's rights have been crushed in terms of people's right to life, particularly in care homes, when we look at the people who have died with COVID, disproportionately it's been older people, and it's been Black and minority ethnic people who have died. And that's really shocking. So what does that say about the rights of people who are living in care homes? You know, where do they factor in terms of how do we move this forward? And who's going to stand up for them? You know, and I think those are great questions as well about how do you get those rights then in practice? If you don't physically, if I'm a housing manager and I didn't have a house to give, what would I do? Whose responsibility is that? So that would mean that we'd all be chapping on Kevin Stewart's door saying, "Oi, see that budget for affordable housing? It's still no big enough. We've been telling you that for 30 years, and it's still no big enough." So, great question, Lindsay. Thank you.
Two other hands up now. We've got Grace who's first, and then Rose.
Okay. What I was going to say is that Scotland is a bit ahead of the game in that they don't apply the priority need requirement. So which means anybody is entitled to apply, and it's up to the provider. And because most of the social housing is run by housing association, so the housing association usually decides who they want to house or not, although some will go through the casework team through the local authorities. And the other issue is that they're also ahead in terms of regulating the private sector. We recently had a law that says the tenancy in private sector are now unlimited. So they're not restricted to 6 months, 6 months, 6 months renewals. So that's a good start. In terms of shortage of social housing, it's important for maybe the housing options team or casework team to work with the private sector. So where there is no social housing, you procure from the private sector to rent out to the public. People can have a choice whether they want to rent in private sector or in social housing. So normally you give an incentive to the private landlords to bring in their properties, you procure, because I've worked in that kind of system in England, we call it housing options. So because there's a housing shortage, so what we do is recruit from private landlords because there's a priority need system. So all those who are not in priority need, we accommodate in the private sector. I think that's what I've got at the moment.
And I think that's a really interesting point as well. If you're looking at human rights and who's responsible for delivering them, what it says is that duty bearers are responsible for delivering human rights. So we're citizens, we're able to claim those rights from those who hold their rights and have already agreed to look after them. So in Scotland, that would be like local authorities, but it would also be housing associations. And I don't think housing associations have cottoned on to that yet, that they will also be duty bearers in relation to the rights of housing. And as well as that, if you're a private landlord and you're then getting money from the state to support and provide housing, you will also be a duty bearer. So there will be obligations then on duty bearers as well. And I don't think that people are really live to that yet in the housing world, that if this law comes into force, it could mean pretty big transformative changes for Scotland. And I don't think we're totally switched on to that yet, if I'm honest, Grace.
Yeah, it just needs a bit of coordination because everybody's doing their own thing, but there's potential for it to work because Scotland is not as congested as London is or places. So it can work if the institutions come together. For example, what you're saying about housing associations not taking, doing their bit in that sense. Because if they haven't got enough properties and somebody's applying to them and they're literally homeless, they should immediately refer that person to the housing section team. But it doesn't usually happen because the person is requested, is told about it, and to go to but because they don't understand these things, so they won't go to another institution. And sometimes they'll be saying, oh, I want to stay in this area, I want to stay in this area. In that case, there must be temporary housing in the area to house such people who can't move to other areas. And Section 5 should try and step in, or whichever way they agree between the two institutions.
And we have seen such incredible working together during COVID. I don't know about you, but I mean, I've seen incredible partnership working that where before there might have been a bit of barriers. I think, you know, envisaging a new possible, we're right on time for that because there's been fantastic work happening across Scotland, and especially I see in the housing sector. Does anybody else have any thoughts?
Rose had her hand up as
Rose.
well. Rose. No, you just need to unmute, Rose.
Okay. Right, thanks. Just to come back in, this is a bit off the question, but I think one of the groups that will particularly benefit is older people whose voices is not often heard. And I'm particularly interested in older LGBT people, of which I'm one myself, and their rights. I've discussed this in various forums elsewhere, and I'm also interested in disabled people's rights, because I'm a member of an LGBT disabled group run by Glasgow Disability Alliance, and we've been discussing this human rights law elsewhere on Zoom. So it's quite pertinent to me that this has come up at this time. So it's been really useful.
So do you think that the new law will be helpful then for people who've got disabilities in terms of bringing the UN Declaration on people for support with people with disabilities into law? What's been the feedback that's been happening at Glasgow Disability Alliance? Are folk welcoming this law, or are they worried about it?
Yes, I think so. I think so. And we've had just a brief discussion about it, and I had to actually leave early to cook my dinner, but which often happens on Zoom calls in the evening. But I think it'll make a big difference. And listening to, as I said, older LGBT people, I've got a concern about people moving into care homes as LGBT people, that their rights are not often acknowledged. Particularly couples moving into LGBT couples moving into homes where they might not be accommodated with the same room or a double bed or whatever. So that's something that I was involved with years ago in discussions with LGBT older people. So that's one of the things I think it would benefit as well.
Great. I know that one of the bits of legislation that they want to write in the new Act is specifically about LGBT rights, because actually there's not a treaty internationally which says specifically that people who are LGBT have specific rights. And that's a big gap actually internationally. So the fact that Scotland's already thinking that's a gap is something that is to be welcomed, I think, in that sense. So,
but I think Scotland is very progressive in LGBT rights anyway. We've seen things like civil partnerships and marriage introduced way ahead of everybody else in the world, and so I think Scotland is a progressive country. I'm doing my wee bit now for promoting Scotland, but I think Scotland is a great place to live and very progressive in its aims and objectives. And it's a lovely place to write because we have a lot of rights and a lot of cultural things that other countries are lacking.
Thank you so much for that.
Do you have your hand up again?
Yes, she has.
Yes, no, it's just one bit. It's just one bit I forgot when I was speaking earlier. Leslie raised a point about housing conditions. And of late, I've seen a lot of social housing being upgraded in terms of heating, making sure they're insulated, really bringing them up to almost new properties. But then you have the homeowners. You have the homeowners who perhaps are on low income or elderly or whose houses are now dilapidated and in bad conditions. And then there's this rule that by, is it 2030 or 2025, that all the properties have to meet certain requirements. And we just wonder what's going to happen in the private sector and homeowners so that they meet these. I keep hearing there's grants here and grants there, but where are these grants? Do people know about these grants? So who is getting these grants? Where are they being provided? So it's all those things for homeowners and the private sector. How are they going to meet these environmental requirements?
Great question. I don't have an answer to that, Grace. The questions are just as important as not having an answer, though, because I think that helps the people who will be writing the new laws to think it through properly.
Lindsay's got her hand up now.
Yeah, I'm just, my brain's going round like a peary, thinking that, or questioning why the different groups in society would need different rights. If the human rights accorded every individual the same right, why do we need different levels of rights
Great question. It's not different levels of rights, but it would mean that the state has to consider things like when they're doing, for women's rights, the Scotland has to report on what's called CEDAW, which is the kind of reporting way for how they progress women's rights. So it might be things like the gender pay gap. It's about recognising, I guess, that some people are marginalised because of who they are and their experiences, and that sometimes there needs to be more effort put into supporting those folk to be able to realise their rights. You're right, though, human rights are for everyone. They just aren't able to be accessed by everyone in an equal way. And I think that's a difficulty. If we were at the situation where everybody was able to access them in an equal way and there wasn't any inequality, that's where we should be. I think that's where we should be heading towards. We're not quite there yet. But good question. Unless has anyone else got a thought sparked by Lindsay's thought there? Pat?
Pat's got his hand up, or Pat got her hand up.
Yes, I think you're right there with the human rights. I mean, everybody's rights, no matter whether you're old, young, man or woman, what colour you are, rights are rights. And when we did the scrutiny on the homelessness in Fife, a single man was very, very much down on the bottom list and would possibly not get considered for accommodation for a long time, which I think is wrong. Just because they're males and they should still get considered or given the same consideration as anybody else. But I think you're right. It doesn't matter where you are, who you are, what colour you are, or what gender you are. Human rights is human rights.
And we see the same as well, Pat, for the likes of veterans or people coming out of the army, or people coming out of prison or other institutions that actually really hard for them to get their housing sorted out, and other rights as well in terms of benefits. Or, I had a session last week with families of people who have family members who are in prison. And one of the big things that they were talking about was that actually there's a lot of pressure when somebody comes out of prison as a family member. They've got to reconnect with their family, maybe their kids. How do they get access to housing? They've been maybe institutionalised for a couple of years. And so that whole process of just being dumped, get out, and not got access to any information or accessibility is really hard. But taking into account as well, how do we support that? How's that going to cost? Well, how much is it going to cost? If we really want this to work, the proof will be in the pudding, if you like. So what does the government need to do to make sure this new human rights law makes a real difference to people's lives? How would you be able, if you're a tenant, how would you be able to claim your rights? What kinds of information, support, resources would people need in your community to do that?
Where that's coming from?
My dad's doorbell's going, but I'm just ignoring it.
Oh. Rose has got her hand up.
Sorry.
Oh, just unmute again, Rose.
Sorry, I keep forgetting to do that. Maybe one of the ways of getting resources would be through tenant participation officers in housing associations, because I get quite a lot of information from Jennifer about various things going on, and I'm quite active, as I said, with the tenant participation team in Govanhill Housing Association. So I feel they could be a good, because it's not just for one tenant or one group of tenants, it's for all the tenants in the housing association. So that would be a good way of disseminating resources and information.
You're on mute, Claire.
Knew it to get caught out. You know, it might be quite tricky to get access to that information in ways that are easy to understand, because it's pretty complex. I know that I'm still learning loads about human rights, so I don't know if there's a message that you want to give back to the Scottish Government about, like, how are people actually going to know they've got rights? And what works, what's good in terms of getting that information out to folk. You know this, you've been tenant participation activists for years. Scottish Government doesn't it? So now's your chance to kind of tell them again.
The Children's Human Rights went through Parliament just last week. So at least the children are well in advance of adults.
You're absolutely right, they are.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's been designed on the back of that is children-friendly complaint processes. Because you know what it's like, if you've got a complaint about your housing, how do you actually get it sorted? It can be quite a long rigmarole, it can be quite a difficult process. If you're a child and you've got concerns around how your rights are being upheld, for example, children who are deaf, I think it's in South Ayrshire, don't have a high school that they can go to locally, so they have to go to Glasgow to get high school. And for them, it's really hard to then keep family connections and their pals from their local primary. So how would they get their rights supported in any way if there's not a child-friendly complaint process? So without having to go, nobody wants to have to go to court. So how do you get some of those things in a real way that people can understand and access? I don't know what folk think about complaints processes that you currently have or you're able to access, and what would make them easier.
Lindsay's got her hand up.
Yes, with the best will in the world, having been a scrutiny panel member for quite a few years, trying to get people interested is not easy. And for the Scottish Government, for the rights, the knowledge about rights to be applicable and workable, every individual would require information. So the Scottish Government have a major problem. How do they communicate with every single adult in the country?
And how would you suggest that happens?
Well, having been shielding during the worst part of COVID, I found that the Scottish Government were extremely efficient in communicating with me. I was quite impressed because I got at least weekly communications, both by text message and by letter. So they have some experience of doing communication on a grand scale. So I basically think they would need to ensure that every individual adult in the country was informed what their rights were and what to do if they weren't happy.
Can I come in there as well? I think there's a lot of amazing experience across Scotland where tenants have written stuff where they've taken the War and Peace that's been produced by the Scottish Government. You're not going to read a 40-page document to get to the bit that you want. So tenants have got a wonderful experience in being able to write things in plain language that are appropriate to people. And I think Lindsay's right, little chunks so that you can digest the little chunks and decide what chunks for you. If you're living in a damp house, that's what you're interested in. If you don't have a house, that's what you're interested in, rather than wading your way through all of the legislation, which is kept all in one place. And I think there's a responsibility for landlords to be aware of all the laws, to train their staff in all the laws, and for the staff to work with tenants so that tenants are also aware of the laws. But I think tenants write far better than some of the professionals who want to do the best thing, but it ends up just being like, oh no, I really don't understand that. So just a thought.
I would completely agree with you, Leslie. Having worked with tenants for 20 odd years, I think that some of the best bits of policy or how things should work are done by tenants, especially in the scrutiny panels that I've seen. Incredible breaking down systems and saying what needs to change and what needs to shift. So I think, you know, when we sent this into the Scottish Government, saying that actually you need to learn from the tenants movement, because you know your legislation, you know how to break it down into wee bits and make it accessible, you know how to make it fun, you know how to shift things and make small changes that will make big impacts for other people in terms of changing allocations policies and things like that. So there's tons that could be learned from tenants and the tenants movement. You know, if that's one thing that gets fed back, I'd be absolutely thrilled with that. You know, I'm always banging the drum for tenants.
Are they going to do anything in the schools, educating kids about their human rights then, especially after the children's human rights coming out?
There is work going to be happening in relation to how children will learn about their rights, but they're still at the early stage of that, to be honest. But that's a good point to put back, because it's not just about adults knowing their rights, it's about children as well. So the right to housing also applies to children who are living in or who are home, not having access to homes. So there's going to need to be a massive learning for people, for communities, for community groups, for tenants groups, for housing officers, for housing managers. When you think of this, it could be massive.
Lindsay, do you want to ask a question again?
Well, really just to make a statement. Way back when my daughter was at primary school, and we're talking, she was born in the 60s, so about late 60s, she was at primary school, and she came home with a booklet which said, "Your Human Rights Explained." And she was at primary school. So they've done it before, so they should have a residue copy somewhere and amend it appropriately to bring it up to date.
Here. Can we do a round of applause? You're absolutely right. There's loads of great stuff out there as well. There's a lot of good organisations doing work with kids. I live in Trinent in East Lothian, although I'm in Dundee now in my father's kitchen. But there's been a lot of good work with kids in the Children's Parliament talking about rights, and it's amazing to hear them actually talking about how they can get involved and the right to participate and things like that. So there's loads of stuff that they could be doing and learning from good practice from the 1960s right through to now. Any other thoughts about how people might be able to claim their rights, or what support or resources people might need? You know, if you think of somebody who's older or disabled, or who might find it hard to access the courts, how might they be able to get action on their issues? Rose.
Possibly through organisations like Glasgow Disability Alliance and things.
Do you want to tell us a wee bit more about GDA, just in case there's people that don't know about what
Glasgow
GDA
Disability
is?
Alliance is an organisation that promotes the rights of disabled people across Scotland. Well, across Glasgow, really, mainly. But I'm sure people from Scotland feed into it as well. And I've been at a number of conferences and things with them, and they're a very good organisation, and they have various subsection groups. As I mentioned, the LGBT group, and we do a lot of discussions about rights and access to rights and things. So I think they'd be an excellent, I think they're an excellent organisation, and I'm sure they'd be a good organisation to promote the voice of disabled people generally, although they're mainly based, it's Glasgow Disability Alliance, so I think there'd be a good voice for Glasgow, and they do a lot, you know. I think they're excellent.
Thanks, Rose.
I think my worry is that people get shunted about from pillar to post. I agree with exactly what Rose was saying, because Rose knows where to go, and a lot of people there do. But what about the folk who have no idea where to start? We need to have some organised, and I'm not sure what that looks like at the minute, but I do worry about people just losing hope because they've been to a number of different organisations, and it's not us, it must be the next one or the next one or the next one. And I think the previous one about, the first thing is that people need is the information, and included in that information should be in each, if we're saying we're putting it down to small bite-sized chunks, they written by tenants, then we need to include in there where to go next and what to do next, rather than just saying this is the law. It has to be, you know, and the next step is.
Fantastic.
Grace has got a hand up.
Grace, you.
Do you want to pass your question, Grace?
Just to add on to what Leslie has said in terms of finding a system, and I think there needs to be a system whereby people are actively referred, a system, partners coming together, who does what. So if people need legal advice, which organization do they go to? And an organization has to make a specific referral to that organization with a brief story of what has happened, and then all the way on to the courts, because in most cases it's to do with benefits that have gone wrong, or claiming the wrong benefit, or not getting the right benefit, and people go into arrears easily because they don't know what to do or what's happening with their benefits. With some people who are working part-time, it's up and down, and things that happening with the rent arrears. So if somebody's got rent arrears, they should be referred to CAB for debt advice immediately. And people like CAB or other organizations that provide debt advice should be able to liaise with the Housing Benefit Office to say what's gone wrong, and because CAB will know exactly what that person is entitled to and what they are supposed to claim, and then go back on behalf of that tenant to the housing office, Housing Benefit Office, to try and put things right. And if they are not on benefit, again, manage their debts through a professional debt advisor. So if the organization can work a bit more together in terms of actually following up the cases with each other, then most of them, well, some of the problems might be minimized.
Mm-hmm. Great points, Grace. And I know that kind of going back to Rose's point as well around GDA, is that the new law, they're talking about this new law, it wouldn't have to be the individual who's then taking a case, but that actually it could be organisations like GDA or Citizens Advice who could support taking a case around rights issues. So for example, the bit that you talked about around benefits being cut or people not actually being referred at the right time quickly enough, those are failures in relation to the state in terms of how the welfare system runs. So that failure from the person not being notified properly about their benefits then leads to arrears, then leads to evictions, without there being any intervention or support. And that those failures right at the very start cost a lot of money to the taxpayer, but also cost so much distress, hurt, anger. People are just downtrodden when they get a letter in saying that they're getting evicted because of failures actually by the welfare system. It's so hard. So
I think that's when it comes down to what Leslie was saying earlier about landlords making sure that their staff are trained properly, because if they're if they're interviewing somebody who's came across something, then they can refer them there and then. And a lot of landlords have got welfare benefit officers now as well, because sometimes by the time you get an appointment for citizens' advice, it's a week down the line, and then that's another week. And so they've got people, because benefits are so complex as well, they've got their own welfare benefits officers, so they can maybe assess things. I think that universal credit's a great example of people's human rights, because a lot of people weren't able to apply for universal credit because they weren't online, they didn't know what they were doing, and then they were halfway through an application and they were getting kicked off it, and it was because the system didn't work, especially at the beginning. And I think even now it's still taking too long for people to get payments. So I think it is. I think the staff really need to be trained up on what people's human rights are and who they can refer people onto, not necessarily the person themselves.
brilliant points.
Any more questions?
More there. I think the last question that we've got in the consultation is, what's your final message to the National Task Force and the Scottish Government? It would be good if we can hear from everybody around what's your final message. If you had the National Task Force sitting right in front of you now, what would be the thing that you want to go shake them and say, make sure you do this?
Who wants to go first? Lindsay, I think your hand was up first, and then we've got Rose.
I would just like to say, listen to what people are telling them. Actually listen and hear what tenants are saying, and the people that are involved in the consultation. It's all very well saying that consultation was carried out, but unless the consultation was done in a meaningful manner, it's a waste of time. It's lip service. So I think the Scottish Government need to listen to what's put in front of them.
Rose?
I've not got a wee thing that I can clap.
Yeah, I totally echo Lindsay's point, that they have to listen to what people say and not just make it a process, a kind of, what's the word, process they're going through, you know, and that they listen to all groups, you know, and get feedback from all groups and not just specific groups, because there will be groups that will be missed out, you know.
Pat, you've got your hand up too.
Yes, I would just like it to be in layman's language, anything that they put out in leaflets, not in government speak, because some people just can't understand government speak. If it's in layman's language, people would approach other people. You know, if it's in government speak, they don't know who to go to.
Yeah. Anybody else?
I was just going, I kind of agree with what everybody has said, so far. Brilliant comments, I have to say, absolutely brilliant. But I would just say as well, make sure that it's inclusive and unbiased and that every group is considered. I think that's probably the most important thing, in-depth research to every person and every area and every circumstance.
Mm-hmm. Can I just say, it all comes down to politics, depends on who you're voting for. And I know in Lanarkshire here, the local authority is controlled by the Labour Party, and the other parties are complaining about the cuts they're making. But their masters are SMPs in Edinburgh, and they're blaming the Westminster Government. So it's all been round a circle. This morning, I've been involved with a meeting about the new Monklands Hospital in Lanarkshire, and it must be now at least 4 years we've been talking about it. Yet China can build one in 2 weeks.
Yeah. Thanks, John. Grace, you've got your hand up as well.
I was going to say, because everything, almost everything has to be done online. And then we have to deal with digital poverty. People who have no access to the internet to actually do these things. Or even if they have access, they don't know how to. You have to go into the library to try and do your forms or something, but there's no one there to even go through it with you. So what do we do about people who have no access to the digital world when everything is online?
Yeah, thanks, Grace. Rose? Oh, you're on mute again.
Sorry, just to echo Grace's point, I think that's where this access to digital and information and processes that older people will particularly lose out. I mean, my mum's 85, and I mean, she's continually told, go on the internet, use email and all this kind of stuff, do it online. And I mean, she doesn't have the access to, she doesn't have a computer for starters, and she doesn't have access to email, and she doesn't understand what an email is, which is not surprising at her age. You know, I mean, all this, I'm only getting a fay with it myself. I mean, I've been using computers for a long time, but in terms of even things like Zoom, which only came along at the beginning of lockdown, I had to be shown how to access Zoom. And I mean, I'm quite computer literate. So I can imagine how older people would really struggle a lot. And other people that, as Grace says, that don't have access to digital ways of communicating.
I used to remember Zoom as an ice lolly. That shows how old I am.
You were? Those are great points. Leslie, have you got anything to add back, or the TPAS team? Any of your big calls to the Scottish Government? What would you be saying?
I think bring it on and resource it, and involve the people on the ground, because they're the people that experience it. Civil servants are great at writing it, but they don't actually live it. So we need to make sure it's developed by people who are living it. And yeah, just go for it, big style. And thank you for doing this, Claire. It's brilliant. Delighted to be able to host it with you. Thank you.
It's great to be here. Any other final thoughts that we can feed back to the Heejins, who'll be the big brain boxes, whose brains will be bursting out of their heads because they're so clever about writing consultation and stuff. Any other final thoughts that we want to feed back?
Well, just in the similar kind of grounds, the Scottish Parliament had a webinar, was it last month, Leslie? We done a webinar with the Scottish Parliament, and it was on, it was talking about people's issues with rent arrears and stuff during lockdown, and like access to welfare benefits, and it was talking about the welfare benefit system. And we done it through video link, and we only had 4 or 5 people appear, and it was a mix of staff and tenants. And I think because the person that was doing it actually physically got to hear about people's experiences, and also got to see the emotions that it caused as well, I think that made a huge difference. And they actually asked if they could show the video to the committee rather than just writing a paper, because then it really comes across, you get the real human touch and how it is really affecting people. So I think when they're talking about human rights, maybe they should take part in something like this and physically talk to people face to face. This is the only way we can do it just now, unfortunately, but I think doing that is better than just reading a report or doing a survey.
Fantastic. And I know that has been happening with the task force, and whilst I'm chatting to groups like yours kind of all over Scotland, most of those groups are sending in the recordings of their meetings, so that we can use them in little video clips and things as well, so that we can actually let ministers hear the voices of people. It's been really powerful, actually. talking to such a wide range of people in Scotland, folk that I probably in normal tenant participation work, I would never have got the chance to speak to prisoners or their families, or a session with deaf-blind people, you know. So it's been really a powerful experience actually hearing people's stories, and it'll be great if we can get some of that into the Scottish Government as well. So I'd encourage you to send in this recording, Leslie, and then that can be transcribed, as well as you know, we can hear people's voices. There is still time for people to feed back. If you feel like, if you're anything like me, right, I always forget things when I'm on a meeting, and then I'm like, I should have said that earlier. But there is, I've put in the chat box, there's a little Survey Monkey online thing that you can fill in with the same questions that we've gone through today, if there's something that comes to you, or you can just send me an email, and my email address is in the chat here as well, allaourrightsinlaw@gmail.com. But I think maybe Elaine can send out afterwards, so that if people have got particular views that they don't feel have been well enough said today, or you've not had a chance to speak, you just fire that in, and that will become part of the kind of conversation that's been happening. Any final questions before we finish up? No? Well, thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming, Claire. It was really good, really interesting.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's been really interesting. I've really enjoyed it. Learned a lot.
Well, I'm happy to come back and chat to tenants anytime.
Good to hear. We knew that anyway, Claire.
Yeah, you've done a brilliant job today.
Thank you.
I think you've got us all thinking hard.
Good. And onwards to the right to housing in Scotland.
Yay.
Yeah, yep.
Yeah. Thanks, Claire. Thanks everybody for coming along, and thanks to Claire for asking us to host it. Thank you.